On the 26th of January 1945, in the small French town of Holtzviere, a German soldier peered through the window of an aid station as medics rushed past carrying the wounded. His unit had launched an assault hours earlier, 250 men and 6 tanks thrown against what seemed like impossible odds. A single American soldier positioned on a burning tank destroyer. Within 60 minutes, the German force had been decimated. Only 70 men remained fit for combat. The survivors spoke of nothing except the one thing that had stopped them: a weapon, relentless and unforgiving. It was not some secret marvel pulled from German laboratories, not some technological breakthrough designed by brilliant engineers in Berlin. It was simply an American machine gun that had begun rolling off production lines back in 1933. Yet the Browning M2, chambered in .50 caliber, would transform into the most dreaded piece of equipment in the entire American arsenal, not because of what it was, a triumph of engineering, but because of what it did. Its effectiveness was brutally simple and devastatingly total. The German survivors had just experienced what military historians would later call one of the most extraordinary defensive stands in American warfare. First Lieutenant Audie Murphy, bleeding from his wounds and fighting alone, had scaled that burning M10 tank destroyer and seized control of its turret-mounted .50 caliber gun. For more than an hour, he had unleashed that weapon against an entire German infantry company, supported by armored vehicles. The German attack had simply ceased to exist when the Medal of Honor ceremony took place on the 2nd of June 1945, with Lieutenant General Alexander Patch presenting the decoration. The official records stated that Murphy had inflicted approximately 50 casualties on the attacking force. The wounds inflicted by .50 caliber rounds became grimly routine to German medical personnel. These bullets operated by different physics than ordinary rifle ammunition. A rifle round might wound and allow survival. A .50 caliber projectile created catastrophic destruction. The sheer kinetic energy meant that a strike to an arm or leg often meant amputation was the only option. A torso hit was almost always fatal. German field hospitals positioned near active fighting learned to recognize .50 caliber casualties by the distinctive nature of their injuries. Medical teams could offer little beyond comfort and attempts to evacuate patients for surgery further back. Many never made it that far. The impact extended far beyond the count of physical casualties. Units subjected to prolonged .50 caliber fire showed alarming rates of psychological breakdown, exhaustion, and the collapse of fighting cohesion, far exceeding units that faced standard infantry weapons. Medical officers documented that soldiers who had endured repeated exposure to .50 caliber fire, regardless of whether they carried physical wounds, displayed unmistakable signs of severe psychological trauma and combat exhaustion. The knowledge that covering fire could not protect you, that survival depended on chance rather than skill or tactics, generated a sense of complete helplessness that held both medical and military significance. Yet this singular engagement was far from unique. From the Norman hedgerows to the frozen Ardennes forests, from the North African desert to the skies above Germany itself, German soldiers learned to recognize and dread a particular sound. That deep, rhythmic pounding of the M2 Browning, cycling between 450 and 575 rounds per minute, each enormous .50 caliber projectile carrying sufficient energy to penetrate light armor, shatter concrete, and reduce human bodies to fragments. The journey from dismissal to absolute terror had started 3 years earlier. What would follow would be written not in factory production reports, but in the lived experience of German soldiers who encountered this weapon and survived. Those who did survive discovered something that shattered their understanding of modern combat and exposed a fundamental principle of American warfare. The United States had not created the most advanced heavy machine gun. They had created something far more threatening. They had built the most dependable, most widely distributed, and most psychologically devastating crude weapon ever seen. The fear and respect did not begin with terror. It began with something else entirely. September 6, 1943, over Stuttgart. 388 B-17 flying fortresses approached the city's industrial center in the first large-scale daylight bombing raid. The Luftwaffe scrambled every available fighter. Among the interceptors were experienced veterans who had destroyed dozens of Allied bombers over 2 years of sustained air combat. They trusted their Fokker-Wulf 190 aircraft, equipped with 4mm cannons and 13mm machine guns. The German pilots rolled into attack runs from high altitude and ahead of the bombers, following textbook intercept doctrine. At 2,600 feet, they commenced firing. Cannons roared, shells streaked toward the B-17s in the front. What happened next altered everything German pilots believed about air combat. The bombers answered with fire. Not the smoke of aircraft taking damage, but the distinctive flashes of defensive guns. Each B-17 carried 13 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns. A 36-bomber formation meant 468 heavy machine guns, all firing the identical 50 caliber cartridge that maintained lethal effect to 1,830 meters. The formation's combined defensive firepower exceeded 6,000 rounds per minute, a steel wall that no fighter could penetrate safely. German fighters felt their aircraft shudder as 50 caliber rounds tore through wings, engine covers, and canopies. They broke away from attacks, diving downward, trailing smoke and fluid. The day proved catastrophic for the Luftwaffe. 45 B-17s were lost, but German fighter losses were devastating for an air force unable to replace its experienced pilots. The German aircrew did not yet grasp what they were facing. Not merely a weapon, but an entire philosophy of air combat. The Americans had solved the bomber defense challenge not through technological complexity, but through sheer overwhelming firepower. Each B-17G carried between 5,000 and 7,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition distributed among 13 gun positions, with some crews carrying additional ammunition beyond standard loads. Luftwaffe pilots had been trained to respect 20 and 30mm cannons, weapons capable of destroying a bomber with a single accurate shot. They knew explosive rounds that detonated upon impact were deadly, but the American 50 caliber worked through pure penetrating force. It did not detonate, it did not need to. The half-inch diameter projectile, weighing 777 grains, traveling at 2,900 feet per second, carrying 12,000 foot-pounds of energy, simply punched through everything in its path: wings, engines, fuel tanks, and pilots. By October 1943, Luftwaffe fighter commands understood the real threat. Oberleutnant Heinrich Wurmheller, a veteran with 93 confirmed victories, wrote to his family describing what attacking American formations meant. To attack the Americans is to fly straight into a storm of steel. You see the tracer rounds, 1 in every 5, and you understand that 4 invisible bullets accompany each one you observe. When you reach effective cannon range, you have already entered their zone of death. The Germans modified their tactics repeatedly. They attempted head-on attacks, dives from above, climbs from below, attacks from every angle. Nothing succeeded consistently. The American gunners possessed overlapping fields of fire. Coming from ahead meant the nose and top turret guns opened fire. From behind, the tail and ball turret engaged. From the sides, the waist guns fired. From above or below, the ball turret and top turret answered. No direction offered safety. The United States Army Air Forces had arranged their combat boxes of 18 to 21 aircraft in 3-dimensional formations deliberately designed to maximize overlapping defensive fields. However, the real nightmare was not the volume of fire alone. It was the absolute reliability. German pilots operating the Me-109 or 190 understood their cannons frequently jammed, particularly in frigid high-altitude conditions. The German MG-131 13mm machine gun proved more dependable, yet it still required meticulous maintenance and failed precisely when it mattered most. The American Browning M2 operated differently. It fired hour after hour without stopping. It functioned in temperatures ranging from -40 to +40 degrees Celsius. It continued shooting even after absorbing German cannon fire. It kept firing as barrel temperature climbed to glowing red. American maintenance crews swapped overheated barrels in minutes rather than hours, and the gun resumed fire without interruption. Lieutenant Wolfgang Fischer, a Bf-88 pilot conducting bomber intercept missions over German territory, survived the war and provided testimony during post-war Luftwaffe debriefings. His account, recorded in March 1946, captured the growing realization spreading through German aircrew. We called the American bomber formations the flying fortresses. But what actually made them fortresses was not their armor or their formation precision, it was those 50 caliber machine guns that never stopped, never jammed, never presented any opportunity. We lost countless pilots not to American fighters, but to the bombers' defensive fire. It resembled flying into a meat grinder. The land campaign mirrored these lessons with its own brutal variations. June 6, 1944. Normandy. Oberst Hans von Luck commanded units of the 21st Panzer Division tasked with defending against the invasion. Von Luck was no ordinary military officer. He had participated in the fighting at El Alamein, received the Knight's Cross, and would later pen his acclaimed memoir, Panzer Commander. His division stood among the first German units facing sustained American ground combat. Von Luck soon learned that American doctrine had placed 50 caliber machine guns on virtually every combat vehicle. Jeeps carried them, trucks carried them, half-tracks carried them, tanks mounted them on turret roofs. Tank destroyers mounted them. Even ammunition and supply vehicles were equipped with them for convoy security. The Americans had accomplished something the Germans never pursued: complete heavy machine gun coverage across their entire force. In his memoir, von Luck reflected on the tactical implications. We had been assured that our training and tactical methods would overcome American material advantages. At Normandy, I discovered the truth. The Americans required no superior tactics. They possessed sufficient ammunition to sustain losses and prevail regardless. Their 50 caliber machine guns occupied every vehicle, every position, every moment, firing without pause. We could not advance during daylight. Any attempt at movement triggered immediate, overwhelming response. The psychological damage equaled the physical casualties. The German army had developed its infantry tactics around the machine gun. The MG-34, later succeeded by the MG-42, represented excellent design. The MG-42 cycled at 1,200 rounds per minute, earning the nickname Hitler's buzzsaw from Allied soldiers who heard its characteristic sound. German squads carried 1,800 rounds per machine gun and constructed their tactics around protecting the gun crew. This concept, called the general-purpose machine gun, would eventually be adopted by NATO because the tactical logic remained sound. Yet the Germans had never anticipated the scale of American 50 caliber deployment. A single American armored division advancing through France possessed hundreds of 50 caliber machine guns mounted on vehicles. American supply columns followed documented firing patterns, alternating vehicles firing right and left to cover both flanks and disrupt German ambushes. This technique proved particularly effective against Panzerfaust teams attempting to strike American armor at close range. American armored formations employed what they termed reconnaissance by fire. Rather than advancing cautiously and awaiting the enemy's reveal, American units would fire their 50 caliber machine guns continuously into any questionable area. Tree lines, farmhouses, stone walls, hedgerows. The fire volume either suppressed hidden German positions or provoked return fire that exposed them. This tactic, documented in primary sources including tank operations accounts from Normandy through Lorraine, drove German infantry to desperation. German soldiers who had fought the Soviets on the Eastern Front believed they had witnessed industrial warfare at its worst. Then they encountered American firepower doctrine in France. German squad leaders, taken prisoner after Normandy, described the differences in their official debriefings, now preserved in Army Historical Division archives. Against the Russians, we faced massed infantry assaults and artillery bombardment. Against the Americans, we faced machine gun fire that never ceased. They fired at everything. They fired at nothing. They fired to keep our heads down. They fired to prevent movement. They fired because their ammunition supply was endless and ours was not. After 14 days of American combat in the Bocage, no soldier would expose himself during daylight. It was not fear, it was mathematics. Movement meant death. The M16 multiple-gun motor carriage represented American firepower philosophy taken to its most extreme expression. Here was a half-track fitted with 4.50 caliber machine guns housed in a powered turret that had been originally conceived for aerial defense. When all four weapons operated together, they could unleash approximately 2,200 rounds every single minute. The men who served with these machines gave them brutal nicknames. They called them the meat chopper. They called them the crowd moire. Official documentation from the 473rd Anti-Aircraft Battalion in November 1944 revealed something remarkable about how this weapon actually functioned in combat. The M16 half-track had been designed primarily to defend against aircraft, but by late 1944 it had been pressed into an entirely different role. German aircraft had largely vanished from the skies over Western Europe. American anti-aircraft crews found themselves looking downward instead of upward, redirecting their weapons against German soldiers on the ground. The results were brutally efficient. During the Battle of the Bulge, when German forces launched their final major offensive in the West, between December 16, 1944 and January 25, 1945, M16 units repeatedly broke apart German infantry assaults. The crews would simply traverse their four gun mounts across attacking formations, and the sheer volume of fire would shatter whatever cohesion the attack possessed. But perhaps the most revealing story about why German soldiers came to fear the .50 caliber emerged from studying convoy operations. German military doctrine had developed specific tactics for destroying supply columns. Ambush teams would let the lead vehicles pass through unmolested. Then they would strike the middle section of the column, creating a roadblock. Once the convoy was trapped and fragmented, German forces would systematically destroy the isolated vehicles. This approach had worked with devastating effectiveness against British and Soviet supply lines in earlier phases of the war. Against American convoys, the tactic collapsed catastrophically. American logistics doctrine placed .50 caliber armed vehicles distributed throughout the entire column at regular intervals. When an ambush erupted, something entirely different happened compared to what German planners expected. American vehicles would immediately return fire with their .50 calibers, while other vehicles maneuvered to strike the ambush position from the flanks. The volume of outgoing fire proved so overwhelming that German ambush teams frequently suffered heavier losses than the convoys they attacked. German platoon leaders who survived these encounters provided detailed accounts during post-war interrogations. In their early ambush attempts, German forces had positioned infantry with machine guns and anti-tank weapons along roadsides. But American convoys possessed vehicles equipped with .50 caliber machine guns spaced throughout the formation. The return fire from these distributed weapons devastated the ambush positions. German commanders adapted by attempting to target only isolated vehicles, never full convoys. But the Americans had anticipated this reasoning. They moved in strength precisely because they understood that German forces could not effectively strike their convoys. The pattern of fire that American convoy vehicles employed created an ingenious defensive system. Vehicles positioned on the right side of the road fired toward the right flank. Vehicles on the left returned fire across the left side. This overlapping arrangement meant both flanks received simultaneous covering fire. German forces attempting to launch an ambush from one direction discovered themselves under fire not just from that side of the convoy, but from the opposite side as well. This crossfire created a killing zone that made successful attacks nearly impossible. Soldiers operating the .50 calibers had received extensive training. Ammunition arrived in quantities that far exceeded official regulations. Convoy commanders possessed authorization to unleash immediate and overwhelming fire at any suspected threat. The cumulative effect transformed German tactical thinking entirely. By the middle and later months of 1944, German forces had largely abandoned attempts to interdict American supply lines in regions where American air superiority prevailed and sufficient ground forces could respond to attacks. This shift carried profound strategic implications. German commanders could not break American supply lines. American units therefore could depend upon regular resupply of ammunition, fuel, rations, and equipment. This certainty allowed American tactical planning to assume that firepower would be continuously available when the moment demanded it. German planning operated under completely different constraints. German leaders had to account for perpetual ammunition shortages, fuel scarcity, and the certainty that whatever supplies actually arrived would come late and in insufficient quantities. The .50 caliber machine gun functioned simultaneously as both a cause and a symptom of American logistical superiority. It remained effective precisely because, American industry could manufacture ammunition in staggering quantities. It enabled uninterrupted operations because its reliability meant that once ammunition reached the front, it would be utilized effectively. German soldiers watching tracer fire arc brilliantly across darkened battlefields comprehended what they were witnessing. They were not simply observing ammunition expenditure, they were seeing visible proof of an industrial capacity that remained utterly beyond German reach. But the terror extended upward from the ground. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, which American pilots called the Jug, carried 8 Browning M2 machine guns mounted in its wings. A single fighter aircraft could deliver 4,400 rounds per minute of combined fire during strafing attacks. 4 P-47s operating together brought 32 50-caliber machine guns to bear simultaneously on a target area. These aircraft approached at high speed and extremely low altitude, often with minimal warning before the devastation commenced. Pilots would open fire at distances between 600 and 800 meters and methodically walk their fire across German positions, vehicles, and troop concentrations. Soldiers who survived described the experience in terms that conveyed complete helplessness. The effect resembled a horizontal rainstorm of metal that left nothing standing. German supply personnel who endured multiple strafing attacks during the August 1944 retreat from Normandy provided testimony that captured the raw fear of facing American air power. "You hear the engines first," they explained. "By the time you look upward, the aircraft are already firing. The bullets strike the road, the vehicles, the soldiers, everything simultaneously. There exists no cover that provides protection. Stone wall crumble, trees splinter and fall, metal tears like paper. You might be sheltered beside a truck one instant, and the next instant the truck is gone entirely, reduced to fragments and flames. German troops learned instantly to abandon vehicles the moment engines appeared. Losing the vehicle mattered far less than losing the vehicle and its crew." The P-47 achieved particular effectiveness during what American pilots designated armed reconnaissance missions. Rather than striking predetermined objectives, flights would patrol assigned areas, searching for targets of opportunity. Any German vehicle moving in daylight risked attack. Any troop column, any supply convoy, any artillery position. The 850 caliber machine guns supplied sufficient ammunition to engage multiple targets during a single mission. A pilot might strafe a convoy, climb to altitude, spot a German tank platoon, descend to attack it, and then strafe across roads during the return flight home. Each aircraft carried approximately 425 rounds per gun, totaling 3,400 rounds for the entire load, sufficient for extended combat operations. German forces responded by relocating primarily during darkness and during poor weather conditions. But this adaptation imposed enormous costs. Supplies requiring mere hours to transport now demanded multiple days. Reinforcements arrived delayed or not at all. The Luftwaffe's inability to contest American air superiority by mid-1944 meant that German ground forces existed under perpetual threat of aerial attack, and the primary weapon delivering that threat remained the 50-caliber machine gun. The combination of ground-mounted and aircraft-mounted 50-caliber fire created a comprehensive suppression effect that left German commanders with impossible choices. German units could not advance safely during daylight because of strafing attacks from above. They could not advance safely at night because American ground forces employed reconnaissance by fire, sending vehicle-mounted 50-caliber streams across suspected roads and trails. They could not gather forces for counterattacks because American doctrine demanded immediate engagement of any identified German formation with all available firepower, including 50-caliber machine guns that could maintain continuous fire while other weapons were being repositioned. This was the reality that ultimately broke German combat effectiveness in the West. Not a single decisive engagement, not some revolutionary weapon. Rather, the cumulative weight of confronting an opponent whose basic heavy machine gun appeared in such overwhelming numbers and was employed with such lavish expenditure that traditional military responses became irrelevant. German tactical doctrine, German training, German fighting spirit. None of these factors could overcome the straightforward mathematical reality. American forces could deliver superior firepower to any location on the battlefield faster than German forces could respond. A German infantry battalion launching an assault against an American position might confront between 50 and 150 caliber machine guns, all firing continuously, all receiving thousands upon thousands of rounds of ammunition. German doctrine emphasized careful fire discipline to preserve ammunition supplies. American doctrine demanded overwhelming volumes of fire to suppress opposition and maintain battlefield initiative. When these contrasting philosophies collided, American material advantages proved decisive. Urban combat revealed yet another dimension of 50 caliber effectiveness. As American forces fought through French towns and German cities, the 50 caliber proved invaluable for suppressing enemy strongpoints in buildings and for demolishing fortified structures. The massive projectile could penetrate multiple walls of typical European construction. Masonry that would readily stop rifle fire and standard machine gun fire offered minimal protection against 50 caliber rounds. American tank commanders quickly learned to utilize their turret-mounted 50 calibers to suppress upper-story windows and rooftop positions before moving through urban areas. The technique was straightforward, yet devastatingly effective. A tank would position itself at a street corner, and the commander would traverse the 50 caliber across building facades, firing continuously at any likely position. The sustained fire forced German defenders to take cover, enabling infantry to advance. The tank would then move forward and repeat the process at the next intersection. German Panzerhaus teams, which had proven highly effective in open terrain and particularly dangerous in urban settings where they could strike armor at close range, discovered they could not function effectively against American combined arms tactics that integrated 50 caliber suppressive fire into their operations. A Panzerhaus operator required exposure to aim and fire his weapon. American doctrine called for continuous 50 caliber fire on any suspected position. This combination made successful Panzerhaus attacks rare when American forces employed proper combined arms coordination. German company commanders who fought American forces during the Rhineland campaign in the final months of the war described in their post-war accounts the impossibility of effective urban defense against American tactics. German infantry would occupy upper-story rooms with excellent fields of fire. American tanks would approach and methodically destroy the buildings with 50 caliber fire and main gun rounds. The 50 caliber projectiles would penetrate walls and ceilings. There existed no truly safe position. Soldiers would seek cover behind furniture or interior walls, and the bullets would find them anyway. Survival required abandoning positions before American forces concentrated their fire. But abandoning positions meant surrendering ground, and there existed no additional ground left to surrender. The psychological impact of urban combat against an opponent with seemingly limitless 50 caliber ammunition proved profound. German soldiers comprehended intellectually that walls and buildings provided concealment from observation, but not protection from 50 caliber fire. Yet emotionally, the fundamental human instinct to seek shelter behind solid objects remained overwhelming. Watching 50 caliber rounds punch through meter-thick stone walls and continue through multiple rooms destroyed the psychological comfort that shelter ordinarily provided. Soldiers felt exposed even while hidden, vulnerable even when protected by what should have been adequate cover. This psychological erosion accumulated gradually. A soldier might endure one engagement, then another, but each time witnessed 50 caliber fire destroying what should have been safe shelter. Eventually, the accumulated stress of knowing that no position offered true safety, that Americans would and could destroy any defensive position with sustained fire, broke combat effectiveness. Units abandoned positions without direct assault because they recognized that American firepower would ultimately render those positions untenable. The final German campaigns demonstrated the complete superiority of American firepower doctrine. German forces fought with genuine courage and skill, often achieving local tactical victories against numerically superior American forces. But tactical success proved meaningless when American forces could simply concentrate firepower and reduce German positions to rubble. The 50 caliber machine gun formed the foundation of this firepower advantage. It appeared in sufficient quantities to engage any target. It possessed sufficient reliability to fire continuously for hours. It received sufficient ammunition that American commanders never required fire rationing, and it was employed according to doctrine that prioritized suppression and destruction over conservation and precision. German tank crews learned to dread the .50 caliber for different reasons. Though the M2 could not penetrate the frontal armor of German medium and heavy tanks, it could destroy optical equipment, disable external stowage, and suppress accompanying infantry. More significantly, the .50 caliber could penetrate the thinner side and rear armor of numerous German armored vehicles at ordinary combat ranges. American M10 tank destroyers carried a .50 caliber M2HB machine gun positioned on the rear of the turret for anti-aircraft defense and close infantry support. Statistical examination of ammunition expenditure reveals that M10s fired substantially more high-explosive shells than armor-piercing rounds, indicating extensive employment in infantry support roles where the .50 caliber proved critical for what crews termed cleanup operations in confined spaces. A German Panzerhaus team might disable an American tank, only to be cut down by .50 caliber fire from accompanying tank destroyers or infantry support vehicles before escaping. Nighttime combat introduced yet another dimension of terror connected to the .50 caliber. American ammunition used a 1-to-4 ratio of tracer rounds to ball rounds. This meant that every .50 caliber bullet visible to the enemy appeared as a glowing tracer that marked the trajectory of each burst. German soldiers watching American .50 caliber fire at night could observe the traces arching directly toward them, streaks of luminescence that appeared to move slowly enough to track visually, yet that arrived with devastating speed and destructive force. The psychological effect proved profound. Soldiers could see death approaching. They could observe the traces converging directly on their position. They comprehended that for every tracer visible, 4 additional rounds traveled along identical paths. The human instinct to duck or dodge remained useless because the rounds had already arrived before the soldier's eyes registered the tracer. Experienced veterans learned to resist watching the traces, but replacement soldiers would become mesmerized by them, fixated on the deadly light show, frequently freezing in exposed positions until the fire found them. American forces deliberately exploited this psychological effect. Reconnaissance by fire at night involved sending streams of tracer-laden .50 caliber fire across suspected positions. The visual effect proved overwhelming. Entire sectors would illuminate with intersecting streams of traces. The noise of the firing combined with the visual spectacle created an environment that German soldiers described as absolutely hellish. German infantry squad leaders captured near Aachen in October 1944 described the experience during their interrogations. At night you can see them shooting even when they cannot see you, they explained. They fire at sounds, at movement, at nothing. The traces show you exactly where death approaches from, and you cannot escape it. You watch the tracers cutting through the darkness and understand the deadly mathematics behind what you're seeing. For every glowing streak of light that traces across the sky, 4 more rounds are screaming through the air unseen. A single gun firing for just 10 seconds sends 50 bullets in your direction, but only 10 of those create visible traces. You see 10 lines of light and somehow 40 more rounds are already past you. Then the realization hits harder. It's not 1 gun. It's not even 2. There are 5, maybe 10 guns all firing at once. The numbers become absolutely staggering. The sheer volume of fire pouring down is mathematically impossible to survive through bravery or skill alone. Only luck saves you. Only chance. The Germans had their own tracer ammunition too, but their approach to firing discipline was completely different. They used tracers sparingly, almost cautiously. A German machine gun crew might fire a short burst with tracers to check where their rounds were actually going, then switch over to regular ball ammunition to stretch their supply of those expensive tracer rounds as far as possible. The Americans did things completely differently. They loaded mixed belts and just kept firing, night after night. The visual effect was overwhelming. Night after night, the sky lit up with American fire. Even when German guns could shoot faster, the American approach created an impression of firepower that was almost incomparable. It looked devastating because it actually was devastating. But there was a practical advantage too, beyond just the psychological impact. American officers could actually watch their own fire happening. They could see where the tracers were going and make adjustments immediately. If the rounds were falling short of the target, the gunner could see it happen and correct his aim right then. When Germans fired back, it was harder to see what they were doing because they used so few tracers. It was a disadvantage that mattered more than anyone initially realized. American units got better information about whether their fire was actually working. They could watch, adjust, concentrate their fire more effectively than German forces could manage. The Germans recognized the problem and tried to develop answers. They attempted to use their armor more aggressively, pushing tanks forward to close the distance before American .50 caliber fire became overwhelming. It almost never worked. American artillery and air power would engage the German armor at longer ranges, pushing the battle back to exactly the distances where the .50 caliber was most deadly. They tried moving at night and in terrible weather, when American observers couldn't see as clearly. But American supply lines meant ammunition was always there. American doctrine encouraged firing at anything that looked suspicious, whether you had a confirmed target or not. July 25, 1944, brought Operation Cobra. The American breakout from Normandy started with an enormous weight of destruction. Nearly 3,300 tons of bombs fell from 1,800 heavy bombers onto German positions around Saint-Lô. Major General Fritz Bayerlein commanded the Panzer Lehr Division, one of Germany's best formations holding that sector. After the war ended, Bayerlein wrote extensive accounts for the United States Army Historical Division. He analyzed what had happened to his division and to German forces generally. His writing was direct and unsentimental. He described how his division got torn apart during the retreat from the Saint-Lô area. Bombs and artillery contributed to the damage, certainly. But what really broke his forces was something else entirely. It was the constant, relentless small arms fire that made any kind of movement almost impossible. American .50 caliber machine guns were mounted on nearly every vehicle. His troops couldn't move to counter American advances without getting hammered immediately. He concluded something that haunted him for the rest of his life. The Americans had found the answer to the central problem of modern warfare. They had discovered how to deliver overwhelming firepower without needing superior training or clever tactics. Their success came from sheer material advantage. Bayerlein rose to full general and fought through the rest of the war. He participated in the desperate fighting at the Battle of the Bulge. In April 1945, he finally surrendered. But his writings became crucial for understanding how German commanders actually saw American combat methods. He kept returning to the same point in his analysis. The .50 caliber machine gun, operated by ordinary soldiers with minimal specialized training and supplied with virtually unlimited ammunition, created a baseline of firepower that German forces simply could not match. German weapons were more sophisticated. German crews were better trained. None of that mattered. The winter of 1944 brought Germany's last gamble in the West. The Battle of the Bulge was a massive German offensive launched with complete tactical surprise. For those first few days, it almost seemed possible that German armor might punch through to the Meuse River and split the Allied armies in half. Then American logistics kicked in. American units rushed to the Ardennes, carrying their full ammunition load. Even hastily thrown together defensive positions could pour devastating volumes of .50 caliber fire onto German attacks. The battle turned into exactly the kind of grinding attritional fight that American material superiority was built to win. At Bastogne, surrounded American troops used their .50 caliber machine guns with devastating effect against German infantry assaults. The guns kept working reliably even when temperatures dropped far below freezing, even through mud and snow, even through the absolute chaos of sustained combat. German forces made a critical miscalculation in planning the Bulge offensive. They assumed that bad weather would ground American aircraft and reduce American firepower advantage. They were partly right about that. The weather did initially keep American planes grounded, but German planners hadn't considered something important. Ground-mounted .50 caliber machine guns didn't care about weather. They worked in any conditions. and American supply lines could provide ammunition at expenditure rates that German commanders found almost impossible to comprehend. General Hasso von Manteuffel's 1st Parachute Army defended against Allied offensives from November 1944 into March 1945, when he was wounded during Operation Veritable. He faced impossible odds with shrinking resources and soldiers of declining quality. His post-war analysis, like Bayerlein's, focused on the psychological weight of American firepower. He observed something crucial about the German soldiers under his command. By early 1945, they had learned to identify the sound of American .50 caliber fire from great distances. They knew that any position could be hit by these weapons. They understood that any movement would draw immediate fire. They recognized that German forces had no effective counter to this threat. It created what he called a defensive mentality that made offensive action nearly impossible. His forces managed to retreat across the Rhine before the final Allied assault, but he attributed most of his casualties to the constant grinding attrition caused by American heavy machine gun fire during that retreat. The technical details of the M2 Browning explain a lot about why it worked so effectively. The weapon weighed 84 pounds without its tripod, 128 pounds with the M3 tripod attached. Heavy, certainly, but not impossibly so for a crew-served weapon. The effective range stretched out to 1,830 meters. That meant it could reach targets far beyond the range of German rifles and light machine guns. The rate of fire between 450 and 575 rounds per minute was slower than the German MG-42. But that hardly mattered when German crews had limited ammunition while Americans had unlimited supplies. The .50 caliber cartridge itself had impressive capabilities. The standard M33 ball round left the barrel at 2,910 feet per second. Armor-piercing variants could penetrate 19 millimeters of armor at 500 meters. The M8 armor-piercing incendiary round penetrated 16 millimeters and would ignite fuel or ammunition when it went through. The M20 armor-piercing tracer variant punched through 21 millimeters at the same distance. The .50 caliber couldn't defeat the frontal armor of a Tiger or Panther tank, that's true. But it could penetrate half-tracks, armored cars, and the side and rear armor of many German vehicles. More importantly, it could destroy truck engines, puncture fuel tanks, disable artillery pieces, and suppress infantry at ranges where those troops couldn't effectively shoot back. The M2's reliability came from its fundamental design. John Browning had started development way back in July 1917 during the First World War. The 1921 water-cooled version weighed 111 pounds with its water jacket and proved too heavy for mobile warfare. The air-cooled M2, adopted in 1933, eliminated the water cooling system and cut the weight while keeping the reliability intact. The basic operating principles were straightforward, robust, and proven in combat. American manufacturers produced enormous quantities. AC Spark Plug, Frigidaire, Guide Lamp, and Colt all built these weapons. Production reached nearly 2.5 million .50 caliber machine guns of all types during the war years. The M2 HP, the heavy barrel version designed for sustained fire, totaled approximately 350,000 units across all services and theaters. This production level meant American forces never ran short of replacement weapons or spare parts. The Germans understood perfectly well what they were facing. Their own weapons were sophisticated in many ways. The MG-34 and MG-42 were better suited to the squad automatic weapon role. The German MG-131 aircraft machine gun fired at 900 rounds per minute. German 20 and 30 mm aircraft cannons were more destructive per hit than any machine gun. But sophistication meant nothing against overwhelming material superiority. The Americans had built a weapon that was good enough for every role it needed to fill. They produced it in quantities that allowed them to mount it on everything. Every American bomber carried 13 M2s. Every fighter like the P-47 Thunderbolt carried 8. Every American combat vehicle carried at least 1. American infantry companies had organic .50 caliber heavy machine gun sections. Anti-aircraft units with M16 quad mounts could repurpose their systems for ground combat. The weapon was everywhere, always available, always supplied with abundant ammunition, and it always worked when needed. The psychological impact on German forces accumulated slowly but devastated them thoroughly. Individual soldiers might survive encounters with this fire. Units might accomplish tactical missions despite American firepower. But over weeks and months of combat, the constant awareness that Americans could bring overwhelming fire on any target at any time with reliable weapons that worked in all conditions wore German combat effectiveness down. It happened just as surely as if casualties and lost equipment were doing it. This wasn't cowardice from German soldiers. These were veteran troops who had fought across Europe and North Africa. Many had survived the horror of the Eastern Front against Soviet attacks. But something about the American approach to warfare was uniquely demoralizing. The Soviets would mass human waves and artillery. The British demonstrated tactical excellence and coordination. The Americans just brought overwhelming material resources and fired until everything stopped moving. German officers found it harder and harder to convince men to attack when they knew American .50 caliber fire would greet any advance. Infantry became unwilling to move in daylight. Vehicles stayed clustered in cover rather than advancing. The tactical initiative shifted permanently to the Americans. Not because of superior tactics or training, because American doctrine built on unlimited ammunition and reliable weapons simply made German methods obsolete. The hatred German soldiers expressed for the .50 caliber expressed deeper resentment. Craftsmen facing mass production, skilled warriors confronting industrial warfare. The .50 caliber represented everything about American warfare that seemed alien to the German military mind. The casual expenditure of ammunition, the reliance on material superiority rather than superior skill, the willingness to destroy rather than capture or maneuver around obstacles. This wasn't soldiering in the traditional European sense. This was an industrial power calculating that material expenditure was cheaper than casualties and more effective than tactical elegance. After the war, German military historians and former officers provided consistent conclusions. The American .50 caliber machine gun wasn't the most sophisticated World War II weapon. It wasn't the fastest firing or the most accurate or the lightest or most versatile. It was simply the most effective because it combined reliability, availability everywhere, and overwhelming logistical support. The weapon was just part of the equation. The system that produced millions of them, supplied billions of rounds, and employed them according to doctrine that accepted material expenditure as the price of victory, that system defeated Germany. The M2 Browning's legacy speaks volumes about its soundness. 80 years after it entered production, the weapon remains in active service with the United States military and armed forces worldwide. It outlasted every weapon system that opposed it in World War II. It has served in every American conflict from World War II to today. The broader strategic lessons became clear only afterward. German military planning had assumed that superior training and tactical excellence could offset American numerical advantages. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong. The .50 caliber demonstrated that adequate weapons produced in overwhelming quantities and supplied without restriction simply overpowered sophisticated weapons produced in limited numbers and supplied sparingly. German tank commanders who had defeated Soviet armor through superior tactics found themselves unable to maneuver against American combined arms teams built around multiple .50 caliber machine guns. German infantry who had mastered the tactical complexity of the MG-42 found their expertise meaningless when American forces simply saturated defensive positions with sustained .50 caliber fire. German pilots who had refined their skills against the RAF found themselves torn apart by defensive fire from bomber formations that valued volume over precision. The lesson was universal and merciless. In industrial warfare, the side that can sustain higher material expenditure will prevail regardless of tactical skill differences. The Germans brought a craftsman's approach to a mass production war. They optimized for efficiency when the situation demanded overwhelming force. They conserved ammunition when their opponents could afford to expend it without limit. What German soldiers learned through bitter experience was that modern industrial warfare rewards not tactical brilliance or superior training, but the capacity to sustain overwhelming material expenditure. The M2 Browning 50 caliber machine gun became the symbol and instrument of that lesson. German forces brought skill, doctrine, and determination to the battlefield. American forces brought an industrial system capable of producing and supplying heavy machine guns in quantities that made resistance mathematically futile. When those two approaches to warfare collided, the outcome was never really in doubt.